Hello and welcome to another episode of the podcast. I'm Dr. Ben. Happy to be with you here today to discuss gluten. This is a big one. There is a lot of information about gluten and following a gluten free diet. And a lot of people have beneficial experiences in doing so. So I thought it was worthwhile to discuss the pros and cons, the risks and potential benefits of following a gluten free diet and how to do so healthfully. How to do so while, because let's face it, gluten free diet, just right off the bat, there's so many things that are quote unquote gluten free and are clearly not healthy, right? So a lot of people just assume, okay, I'm going to have the gluten-free option. It's going to be automatically the healthy option. Just like if someone were to choose, okay, I'm going to have the vegan option, it's going to be the healthy option. That's not always the case, right? So let's talk about how to follow a gluten-free diet healthfully, but more importantly, why we might or might not want to follow a gluten-free diet. And to discuss this and to break into this conversation, we of course need to understand what the heck gluten is. And I think that this demystification of gluten is really important because a lot of people just think that it's some big boogeyman that's in everything. But the fact is that gluten is a protein. And, a lot of people say, okay, you eat a plant-based diet, where do you get your protein? Well, you can say I get it by eating things such as gluten, which is a protein found just in three different whole grains: wheat, barley, and rye. Now, there are various numbers of different wheat varieties that each contain different amounts of gluten. And it is interesting how the wheat cultivation, not cultification, the wheat cultivation processes have evolved in a way to hybridize and genetically select for varieties of wheat that are higher in gluten. As far as I know, gluten is one of the proteins that gives wheat the kind of stretchy and chewy, and let's face it, delicious quality that a lot of wheat containing products like breads and pastas have. Let's face it, if you chew a rice noodle, it doesn't have the same quality as if you were to chew a wheat noodle. Now, that being said, like I said, the wheat is a protein found in just these three whole grains. There is some evidence, like some people say that there's some odd varieties of oats that contain wheat as well, or contain gluten as well. However, generally it's just wheat, barley, and rye. Now, then why at the grocery store, when you go down the food aisles, is there like a whole aisle dedicated to gluten-free products? Well, that's because gluten is often an additive into a number of processed foods like salad dressings and chicken nuggets and all these sorts of things. I actually, I wanted to. Oh yeah, I've got all these cool graphics that I can share as well. Um, so, so why is gluten in all of these like processed foods? Because it has a quality to it. It's like a thickening agent. It kind of texturizes things oftentimes, and also it's a protein. And sometimes, foods, they want to just add some, nutritional value to it, so they pick and choose a protein, and maybe this protein has that quality, and gluten is a desirable protein to create that kind of mouth feel that a lot of people like in their processed foods. So yeah, let's look at some funny little memes to break into the conversation a little bit. Gluten everywhere. This is a classic one. Yes, it is kind of everywhere. It is in all of our packaged and processed foods. Here's another one. How I spend my time in the supermarket. A little sliver, putting things into my basket, and a huge part of the big piece of the pie is reading labels, noticing the poison, and putting it back on the shelf. So yes, whenever we are looking at products that are contained that are found in packages or boxes or whatever, we want to look at the ingredient list and determine whether or not there's poison in it. But that's not to say that gluten is poisonous. But I thought this was a good little meme. And gluten is bad. This kind of hipster guy following a gluten-free diet, presumably. Gluten is bad, but can't explain what gluten is. Of course, you will be able to explain what gluten is. You already know what gluten is. It is just a simple protein in these plant foods, wheat, barley, and rye. Is it gluten free? Because I'm lactose intolerant. I don't know. I don't really get this meme. I guess the point is that there are more people, more humans who are sensitive to lactose, the protein, or actually not protein, the sugar in dairy, the sugar in milk, than there are people who are sensitive to gluten. But gluten free, like the gluten free industry, if you will, is a multi-billion-dollar industry to create gluten free packaged and processed foods. It's a huge swath of the food industry and growing. I think that this is just suggesting that maybe we would benefit from not consuming dairy. We would benefit more from not consuming dairy, we being humanity, than not consuming gluten. Um, just another cute one, gluten free. And then, oh, this is a good one. Manufactured in a facility that processes wheat, right? And sometimes that you see that kind of asterisk in your food label, like it's technically not gluten free because it's been cross contaminated potentially with other gluten containing products. And you'll see this a lot with oats. Maybe you'll see gluten free oats. And the reason why those oats are labeled gluten free is that they have been milled and processed in machinery that hasn't been used to mill or process other gluten containing grains like the wheat, the barley, and the rye. So this is really only important. This level of gluten-free removal of all of the glutens, removed all of the glutens. It's only important for people who have celiac disease, which is less than 1% of the population. If you have celiac disease, hopefully you know that. Hopefully you've received that diagnosis. Hopefully you have removed gluten-containing grains, gluten-containing foods from your diet, and hopefully you are feeling healthy as a result of that. For the rest of us, even for people who have quote unquote um, non-gluten non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which is actually, like, some say that 20% plus of the population has non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So celiac disease, the actual sensitivity to the gluten protein, that's less than 1% of the population. Non-celiac gluten sensitivity, that's greater than 20, 25, maybe some people say it's like 50% of the population has this non-celiac gluten sensitivity. But do they really? Do they really? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Once I get through some of these, there's a lot of good gluten memes out there on the internet, so you guys. So my doctor asking me to do a gluten challenge. Okay, get into the casket, SpongeBob SquarePants. I guess this is funny if you are really sensitive to gluten, if you know that you are, and you like, it's oh my gosh, it's so scary to eat gluten containing foods. And look at all of this food I can eat. Yes, this is my relationship with a gluten-free lifestyle. Even though I don't follow a gluten-free diet, like if I have breads and pastas on rare occasions, and when I do, I don't ask for the gluten-free option. But that being said, if and when I do follow a gluten-free diet, which is like 99% of the time, I'm eating tons of stuff because remember, the gluten is a protein in only wheat, barley, and rye. There's only 3 whole foods that contain gluten. So that means there are tons of other whole grains like millet and amaranth and teff and oats and buckwheat and so many other things, that so many other grains, I should say, that don't contain gluten. So it's really like no problem. It's so fun and beautiful to enjoy all of the plant-based foods that are gluten-free. Now, when you go into the shopping cart or the food aisles, the center of the grocery store, and you start loading up packaged foods in your cart, it becomes more difficult to find those gluten-free foods because most of the stuff is processed, not only like processed wheat products and processed grain products, but has that gluten additive as kind of the thickening, texturizing agent. Um, so yeah, I'll never understand 5,000 years of eating bread, and suddenly in the course of a decade, everyone is allergic to gluten. And of course, allergy to gluten is different than sensitivity to gluten, right? But at the end of today's episode, I am going to explain to you why there may be an increased incidence of non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And it doesn't have to do with the gluten protein, it has to do with the contamination and toxicity that may be involved with our conventional agricultural practices. Um, is there anything on the gluten-free menu, this cute little kitty cat, besides the carrot? Oh, this sad little kitty cat. Yes, such a sad state of affairs we live in, and everything on the menu is full of gluten except for the carrot. Well, hopefully that's certainly not the case, right? But anyways, let's talk about some of the facts about what we already talked about what gluten is, and we already talked about kind of some of the issues with the conventional wheat products that are hybridized to contain more gluten. So maybe that is playing into this gluten sensitivity. However, that's not really clear because there's a lot of evidence to suggest that containing or consuming more gluten containing grains, like if you consume like a low gluten wheat versus a high gluten wheat, consuming the high gluten wheat can have numerous beneficial effects in terms of regulating cholesterol levels and triglycerides because it kind of binds to things and shuttles it out of the intestines, some theorize. So it's not really that cut and dry that eating gluten is inherently bad. Um, However, I want to talk about not that meme, sorry. I want to talk about really the risks associated with eating gluten-free products because we need to address the fact that a lot of the gluten-free items out there are just as nasty or more so than a lot of the conventional whole wheat, if you will, breads and products. So you see here's I've never had Udi's, but I guess Udi's is a popular gluten-free bread. And you see just, I've got the ingredient list here. You see water and pea starch and tapioca starch and rice starch, a bunch of starches in there, rice flour, canola oil. We're not a fan of that, right? Sorghum flour, tapioca starch, cane sugar, egg whites, cane sugar, more cane sugar, invert cane sugar. What's that? Modified cellulose, apple cider vinegar, salt, yeast, cultured brown rice, guar gum, xanthan gum, enzymes, contains eggs. So there's a lot of stuff in there. Now, granted, it is mostly like food, mostly food stuff, even though it's a lot of starches and whatnot, but it's just like sugar, oil. I don't know. And then, this is our go-to favorite bread that is not gluten-free. This is not a gluten-free bread. This is Ezekiel bread. Ezekiel bread contains a number of different sprouted whole grains. And I use whole grains like in quotation marks because, of course, they've been ground in order to make this flour to bake this bread. But you see here the ingredients: organic sprouted wheat, filtered water, sprouted barley, sprouted millet, sprouted organic malted barley, sprouted lentils, soybeans, spelt, yeast, and organic wheat gluten. Oh, so they add in, well, that's pretty interesting news to me. They add in a little bit of that extra wheat gluten in order to make it a little even more bready. So you can see here that this by no means is a gluten-free bread. However, I would most definitely choose this over the one with the oil and the sugar and a lot of the processed starches and whatnot. This is just kind of whole wheat flour, if you will. And when I say whole wheat, they grind the whole, which contains more of the fiber. And as a result, I don't have the nutritional label here. This is a higher fiber bread, which is really healthy. And whenever, little sidebar, whenever we're consuming processed grain products, it's always a good rule of thumb to we don't look at the nutrition facts that often. We prefer to focus on the ingredient list. But if we are to look at the nutritional label, it's always a good rule of thumb to choose a product that is higher in fiber, or specifically look at the ratio of fiber to total carbohydrate, and choose the product that is higher in, that has a closer ratio of fiber to total carbohydrate, right? So here's another just look at some of the crazy wacko gluten-free products out there. There's gluten-free Oreos, apparently, gluten-free mac and cheese, gluten-free chicken nuggets, gluten-free cookies, of course, gluten-free potato chips. Well, potatoes don't have gluten in them. And of course, gluten-free candy and gluten-free applesauce. Well, of course. So this is just, I put this together just to show us that, well, there's a lot of garbage out there that's gluten-free, and by no means does that mean it's healthy. However, maybe if I were celiac, if I had celiac disease and I wanted Oreos, for sure, I would choose the gluten-free Oreo. If I wanted to eat Oreos and I had celiac disease, there's no doubt about it. However, the point also is that gluten-free is a trendy thing. It's super duper trendy. And the way that I see it is that it's simply the trendy nutritional intolerance. It's the trendy food sensitivity. And we've discussed before about the underlying cause of food sensitivity, and that is intestinal dysbiosis. That is the dysregulation or disproportionate bacteria in the intestines, the small intestines and the large intestines. And having that dysbiotic microbiota environment leads to an overgrowth or fermentation of different fibers and phytonutrients and proteins. And essentially, if we put in a lot of these foodstuffs and we don't have the microbes in our gut to help us digest those foodstuffs, then we can, those foodstuffs can sit there and ferment and cause gas and bloating and inflammation. And then in some instances, create the scenario of what we've referred to as increased intestinal permeability, or a leaky gut phenomenon, which can lead to systemic responses throughout the body. So the answer to this, the resolution to this, is not by just restricting foods and avoiding foods and kind of nurturing the dysbiotic environment and just like, okay, we've got this unhealthy gut microbiome, but we're just going to remove all of the proteins and fibers and phytonutrients and foods that irritate that microbiome. That's not really a long-term sustainable solution. In actuality, we want to introduce more of those foods and more of the diverse whole foods that are fiber rich and phytonutrient rich and rich in all these, unique proteins, including gluten, that feed and nurture the microbiome and promote adaptation and evolution. And in so doing, we create more microbial biodiversity and more harmony in the gut microbiome. And that creates more resilience. And we create this biofilm that helps to protect that single cell layer of enterocytes that line our digestive tract. And then we're more resilient to the potential insults from foods or toxicity, and we don't have that leaky gut phenomenon. We have an intact gut barrier, and we have a healthy immune system just beneath that gut barrier, and we're in that state of harmony. So the way that I see it is that all sorts of people can have potential food intolerances, and there is kind of this what's the word there's this kind of group think mentality. We've been infected. Our culture has been infected with a little bit of a mind virus, to suggest that it's like we can just boil down all intestinal issues due to one singular protein, just because it's kind of trendy, and it's just kind of like the food intolerance of the decade. This trendy thing to avoid. And I'm saying this because there's a lot of evidence, and I just captured this study here. There's a lot of evidence that there's a very strong placebo and nocebo effect when it comes to non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So I just thought I'd read the abstract from this article here. A double-blind placebo-controlled gluten challenge has been proposed to confirm a diagnosis of non-celiac gluten sensitivity in patients without celiac disease who respond to a gluten-free diet. To determine the accuracy of this approach, we analyzed data from 10 double-blind placebo-controlled gluten challenges. Blah, 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 blah. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Most of the studies found gluten challenge to significantly increase symptoms across symptom scores compared with placebo. However, only 38 of 231 non-celiac gluten sensitivity patients, or 16%, showed gluten-specific symptoms. Furthermore, 40% of these subjects had a nocebo response. So that means that they had similar or increased symptoms in response to placebo. So, for instance, just to make sure you're following, just to reiterate this, people were given like a gluten-free piece of toast, or people were given a gluten-full piece of toast and told it was gluten-free, and they didn't have symptoms, or vice versa. People were given a gluten-free piece of toast and told it was gluten-full, and they did have symptoms. So it's not really clear. It never really is. There's a very strong placebo response, really, when we're talking about everything in the body, but for sure our digestive function, because it's directly connected with the state of our thinking and autonomic nervous system. So in the end, these findings reveal heterogeneity and potential methodology flaws among studies of gluten challenge. Cast doubt on gluten as the culprit food component in most patients with presumptive non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and highlight the importance of the nocebo effect in these types of studies. So yeah, I find this pretty fascinating. It's not really news to me. Again, like I said, the placebo nocebo response is very powerful, especially when it comes to digestive issues. But I'm sure we've all had this kind of experience where we, eat something that, we know our digestive system has a hard time with, but we tend to digest it just well. Or maybe we eat something totally healthy, but we have issues. And because it's just such a complex phenomenon. However, that being said, gluten sensitivity is real. And I don't want to just cast this all out as just some psychosomatic phenomenon, and just nutritional, food sensitivities are just kind of all in your head. The fact is that the microbiome is real. The intestinal permeability phenomenon, the increased intestinal permeability phenomenon, is very real and measurable. And there's a lot of science demonstrating how real that is. However, is gluten really the issue? And I want to complete today's episode by talking about really what has been occurring in our environment over the last, I guess like 30, 40, 50 years, with the advent and introduction of glyphosate, the herbicide, especially in the GMO conversation, because there's a lot of evidence not a lot of evidence. There's new theories. Well, not really new theories, but there is a theory that makes a lot of sense that seems to suggest that it's really not gluten that's the issue, but the toxins that are associated with the gluten containing grains. And those toxins primarily being glyphosate. So, this article is worth a read. This is definitely worth a read. It's a great article by Dr. Stephanie Seneff. Dr. Seneff has been doing a lot of research on the topic of glyphosate, amongst other things. She's pretty brilliant, and she's definitely thinking outside of the box, and sadly receiving quite a bit of criticism from kind of the mainstream science, quote unquote, scientific community, if you will. However, a lot of praise from people like me who tend to think outside of the box and challenge the system, if you will, because quite frankly, the system isn't coming up with any real sustainable solutions or answers to the questions that we, society, humanity has. So this article is titled "Glyphosate: Pathways to Modern Disease, Celiac Sprue, and Gluten Intolerance." Really talks about how there's a lot of evidence that the effects or the symptoms of gluten sensitivity can be totally, completely attributed to glyphosate toxicity. So I'm not going to dig really deeply into this because that could be hours and hours in and of itself. But I'm bringing this up onto the screen for you to research this and look into this and give it a read, or maybe listen to some podcast interviews with Dr. Stephanie Seneff. Definitely a great mind to discuss this issue. And the moral of that story is that conventionally grown wheat, barley, rye, and all whole grains are heavily contaminated with glyphosate. And that's due to the fact that glyphosate is used not necessarily as a weed killer in these cases, but as a desiccating agent to just kind of kill, or well, I guess what farmers often refer to as ripen, kill or ripen the crop so that the crop can be harvested uh, quickly and efficiently. And that allows farmers to then get a second, or in some cases, third or fourth harvest in their field in just one season. So, using these desiccating agents, which are chemical toxins that kill the plants, allows them to harvest the wheat, barley, rye, and for that matter, other legumes and crops as well. Um, so what that means is when we're consuming these grains that have been cultivated conventionally, we're generally consuming a good dose of glyphosate with that grain. So our sensitivity to the grain, the sensitivity to the wheat or the barley or the rye, might not be our sensitivity to the gluten protein, but sensitivity to the glyphosate toxin that is on the wheat grain, on along with the gluten protein. And there's a lot of molecular physics involved in this conversation. The fact that the glyphosate molecule actually resembles, in many cases, the gluten protein, and our immune system gets confused and sees the gluten and thinks it's glyphosate because it's been used to seeing gluten and glyphosate together all the time. So we take away the glyphosate even, and we just see the gluten, and our immune system is still in a state of confusion. And so some people, there's some anecdotes that people do benefit from removing the gluten, even the organic gluten, to give their immune system just an opportunity to cleanse itself or balance itself and reestablish that kind of intelligence to seek out what it needs to seek out the toxins rather than the innocuous proteins. Anyways, it's kind of a confusing topic. I hope I didn't lose you, but if I did, hope you're back and we can wrap this conversation up, to just on the note of choosing the organic whole grains. And that really is an important thing, because I think a lot of people hear glyphosate and they just immediately think genetically modified foods like canola and corn and soy, because this topic is worthy of a complete episode in and of itself. But I just wanted to introduce the idea that GMO crops have predominantly been genetically modified to withstand the harsh effects of the glyphosate compound. So canola, corn, soy, sugar beets, cottonseed, like I think those are the main genetically modified crops. So they're what are referred to as GMO or glyphosate ready or Roundup ready seeds. So you can essentially just spray them with tons and tons of glyphosate, and the glyphosate kills the weeds but doesn't kill the crops. So anyway, so people think like, oh, those are the only dangerous crops that you definitely want to avoid. But I just want to highlight the fact that glyphosate not only is used on these Roundup ready crops, but it's used as a desiccating agent for the other grains that aren't quote unquote GMO, but the conventionally grown grains like wheat, barley, rye, as well as a lot of others, as well as again, the legumes, sometimes heavily sprayed with glyphosate. So, just a plug to consume and a reminder to consume the organic varieties of these grains. And also, the big take home here is that we should be eating whole foods. And when we eat whole intact grains versus processed and refined grains, we also give our digestive system a greater chance at optimally breaking down and absorbing and assimilating things. Because processed grains are deplete in nutrients, deplete in fiber, and they aren't really nourishing and nurturing the microbiome to create that resilient state to reverse the dysbiosis. So our goal is reversing intestinal dysbiosis, increasing biodiversity in the gut. And the only way to do that, we've said it time and time again, the only way to reverse dysbiosis, increase biodiversity in the gut is by increasing biodiversity of whole plant foods that you're putting in your mouth. And hopefully they are organic and free from toxicity, free from preservatives and additives and stuff like that. So yes, if you want to follow a gluten-free diet, it's easy. It's easy as why am I blanking on her name? The Sound of Music actress. It's so beautiful. Look at all this food I can eat. You can eat anything except for wheat, barley, rye. If you do want to follow a whole food plant-based diet that's free from gluten, just don't eat wheat, barley, and rye. And wheat, barley, and rye, of course, that just means don't eat processed grains, because how many people are eating whole intact barley, wheat, and rye? I do from time to time. They are good. They are delicious intact whole grains. However, they're kind of hard to come by. Most of the time people are consuming wheat, barley, and rye in these things, in these processed foods. And this is an okay way to consume wheat, barley, and rye. This one, I don't know. Do with that as you will. But that's the moral of the story. Don't fear gluten. Just understand what it is. And like I said, I'll end by just sharing my relationship to the gluten protein. Like I said, I don't, I'm not gluten free. I don't eat processed. I eat minimal amounts of processed grains. For sure, if I go out to a restaurant, it's like, okay, I'm gonna like that, and there's a pasta dish that's like the veggie option, then yeah, I'm not gonna say, oh, does that pasta contain gluten? I'm going to give my body a dose of some new proteins, new fibers, new phytonutrients to nourish my microbiome. That's my relationship to it. So I think that there is a risk for being long term. I not only do I think, but I've come across some research to confirm that there is a risk for being a long term gluten free eater if you don't have celiac disease. Because if you're not consuming gluten containing grains, then you're probably missing out on a number of different fibers and phytonutrients that will nourish and diversify your microbiome, that's the name of the game here. So I don't want to blabber on too much longer, but just want to remind you guys to join us starting a week from Friday in the Alter Health Spring Cleanse. If you want to take your health to the next level, flood your body with awesome, nourishing foods and beverages. You can learn more at www.alter.health/cleanse. And thanks, as always, for tuning in. If you know someone who's still afraid of gluten in 2023, feel free to share this with them. And sorry for being a little bit inarticulate today, but there was just so much to say, and I had a hard time putting this together. I have to admit, because I didn't know where to go with it. But hopefully you got the message. Hopefully you did. And maybe I've got to do a follow-up, and we've got to do a follow-up to talk more about glyphosate and GMO foods, because that's a big one. So maybe that'll be down the pipeline. But until next time, hope you all stay healthy, stay happy, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Peace and love.